Computer. Good. So here we go. So thank you very much for joining us in this session today. It's the 18th day of this pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, and we have probably the longest session so far, which is religious movements, places and landscapes of conversion, that has been coordinated by Johanna Pacyga. And we have quite a good lineup of, finally, it's going to be 7 papers. And before we start, I wanted to share on the chat, as most of you are new to chat, the code of conduct that we developed last year for Festival Chat, because well, we thought it was interesting to have something written up, not to say basically that we should be nice to each other while we are doing a online or in-person conference. So you can have a look at it and of course follow it, please. And well, besides that, I don't want to speak a lot because it's been already 2 weeks of speaking, and I leave the floor to Johanna Pacyga, that is the coordinator. So I think the first presentation is going to be pre-recorded, so we will have James with us, but she can probably introduce you all better than me. So thank you very much, all of you, and especially Johanna, for joining us in this different or strange conference, and looking forward to see you.
Thank you, and thank you so much for all of your work organizing. I know this was kind of a complicated one to fit together with all the different time zones, so really appreciate it. So without further ado, we've got James Flexner with a pre-recorded talk that I will pull up. Let's see. And this is entitled A Walk on the Beach, A Walk in the Woods, Hiking as Kastom Methodology in Vanuatu.
I'd like to start this presentation by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and their elders past, present, and emerging, from whose unceded territory I'm recording this paper, in the land today also known as Sydney, Australia. Motu mi wantum sing out long all chiefs, more elders, more field workers, from Tafaya province, will get I make say research from mi fella, and become possible. There's a very particular sound and feeling that heavy footfalls make in the compact volcanic soils that underlie many of the trails that traverse southern Vanuatu's islands. These are places with limited or no roads suitable for motor vehicles. Remote villages and island interiors are reachable only by travel on foot, often requiring extremely steep ascents and descents, particularly in the rugged terrain of the high islands. Even low-lying Aniwa, whose highest point is only 42 meters above sea level, features some breathtaking walking, including trails that lead to raking views across the sea to neighboring islands. The rhythm of heavy footfalls on a steep trail produces a steady series of thumps that mimics the timed stamping of many kastom or traditional dances. These are performed during particular feasts and festivals in open clearings created for the purposes of dancing and drinking kava. Kava is the intoxicating beverage made from straining water through the masticated root of the Piper methysticum plant. It was traditionally an exclusively male and chiefly elixir, whose consumption produces a dizzying and sometimes hallucinogenic high, followed by a deep sleep. It is the traditional welcome drink offered to visitors. For those who have come from a long distance, kava provides the perfect relaxant after a long day's walk, though its dehydrating effects can be less welcome if one has to continue onwards the following day. From 2011 till 2019, I led archaeological surveys in studying the 3,000 years of indigenous history and colonial encounters in southern Vanuatu. The 5 inhabited islands in the region are, roughly from north to south, Erromango, Tana, Aniwa, Futuna, and Anaitium, as well as the currently unoccupied Matthew and Hunter Islands further south. Erromango and Anaitium are larger high islands featuring ancient volcanic soils. Tana is a high island with active volcanism, with new soils constantly being produced from the volcanic ash falls of Yasur. As Yasur grows, it presses down on the seafloor, and via a process of lithospheric flexure, the low coral atoll of Aniwa and the once submerged volcanic cone of Futuna, with its fossil coral limestone reef terraces, were and continue to be uplifted. Futuna and Aniwa are further distinguished from the neighboring islands by their languages, which are of the Polynesian family. All these islands were and are, however, closely connected through networks of exchange and kinship. Linguistic diversity and polyglottism were and are markers of indigenous life in Vanuatu. We now know with certainty that all of these islands were visited and settled to greater and lesser extents by Lapita voyagers between 3,000 to 2,800 years ago. Over time, people established sustainable landscapes and seascapes of rotating garden plots and actively managed marine resources. Beginning around 1,000 years ago on Futuna and Anaitium, people created extensive terraced and irrigated pond field systems for growing taro, and throughout the islands, rain-fed gardens for producing yams provided the starchy staple for people's subsistence. Taro and yams were supplemented by a variety of fruits, vegetables, and of course, kava. The main source of protein was fish and shellfish, with chickens providing a modest contribution. Pigs were raised primarily for competitive feasting that was a regular feature of chiefly life across different districts, moieties, and kin networks. Roughly 1,000 years ago, there was some form of Polynesian settlement from the east, though archaeologically, there is little to distinguish this period in the outliers of Futuna or Aniwa. Linguistic markers, particularly in the ceremonies and uses of kava and tana, point to these Polynesian contacts. But the settlement patterns, chiefly systems and family structure, as well as material culture on Futuna and Aniwa very much resemble their Melanesian neighbors, despite the linguistic difference. The first European visitors to southern Vanuatu were sailors on Cook's second voyage in 1774. The main point of interaction was Port Resolution on Tana, named after one of Cook's ships, though there is evidence that suggests people from neighboring islands were also present at the time. Sandalwood was discovered in Erromango in the 1820s, attracting small groups of European traders. The traders were unscrupulous and often violent, taking millions of pounds worth of the valuable timber in exchange for a pittance in trade goods, or simply using imported Polynesian labor and excluding the local people. Whaling was also a common industry, with the island of Anaitium particularly involved as a port of call for South Sea whalers. Beginning in the late 1830s, the first Christian missionaries entered the region. John Williams and his secretary James Harris of the London Missionary Society were killed on the beach at Erromango in November 1839. An LMS attempt to settle on Tana was not much more successful. Turner and Nisbet settled in the middle of disputed territory in 1842 and were forced to flee after a few months. After the LMS, there was a wave of Scottish and Canadian Presbyterians. John Getty to Anaitium in 1848, George Gordon to Erromango in 1857, followed by his brother James in 1864. Copeland, Matheson, and Peyton to Tana in 1858. Others would follow in subsequent decades. By the 1890s, with indigenous populations declining an estimated 80 to 90% from Cook's day because of introduced diseases, people resettled in coastal villages clustering around mission sites. Christianity was widely adopted as the professed faith of most people in Vanuatu, but with a particular kastom spin that integrates the European religion within the existing traditional belief system. Archaeological fieldwork in Vanuatu requires a particular approach to documenting and understanding diversity in island life. After independence in 1980, it was decided that these islands could no longer be an anthropologist's playground, with foreign researchers appearing in remote villages, asking intrusive questions, then disappearing with little or no clear benefit to the people whose lives they were recording. After a moratorium on research, which lasted until 1994, a permit system was introduced. To obtain a research permit, foreign researchers must demonstrate that the work will offer some kind of positive outcome for local people, at the least a sharing of the knowledge produced. Further, cultural and environmental research must be facilitated and ideally led to some extent by someone from the national network of filwakas, or field workers, men and women who may not have high levels of formal education, but who are holders of deep cultural knowledge and often hold some rank and authority within their communities. During my first trip to Vanuatu, at the invitation of the Aramongo communities, and particularly the Filwaka Jaritaki, my bags were taken to the wrong island. This meant I spent the first week of fieldwork and survey with only basic handheld equipment, a camera, GPS, notebook, and pen. With this limited equipment, Jerry led me on a custom series of educational walks that took me through time and space in the island. My subsequent experience on Tana followed a similar path, with local elders and community leaders showing me the places that tell their history. Often these histories were told using materials not traditionally considered archaeological, such as unmodified boulders or old trees. The histories recounted on these perambulations were a seamless combination of factual information about the past, but also integrated a variety of supernatural explanations that connected past to present and beyond, a phenomenon the anthropologist Chris Ballard calls historicities. I characterize the places where Ni Vanuatu make their historicities as memory places. In a survey of nearly 100 archaeological features relating to Christian missions and colonial encounters in Tana and Aramongo, this was the most common type of feature I recorded, accounting for over 20% of the total landscape features. Groups of memory places were often narrated in relation to each other, walking from one point to the next while a local expert recounted the story. I call these groups event landscapes, a living historical space where past and present collide. On Aramongo, the so-called Martyr Isle, the main event landscapes I recorded under Jerry's expert tutelage relate to missionary deaths on the island. When John Williams and James Harris arrived on the beach at Dillon's Bay on the 30th of November, 1839, they insisted on pressing inland, despite local people's signals clearly indicating that this was a bad idea. The missionaries broke a major taboo placed by the local Fanlo, or paramount chief, and in doing so, sealed their own fates. They were chased back to the beach and killed with clubs and arrows. The bodies were taken inland, where Williams' blood dripped. A red-leafed lumpot plant sprouted and still grows today. Williams was taken to a particular stone, where pecked cupules provide a sense of his measurements from head to toe and across outstretched arms. He was then taken to a flat stone next to the river, where his body was divided and distributed to the different district Fanlo. Finally, a rotting coconut palm in the bush is said to mark the place where William's skull, the head being the most taboo or sacred part of the body, was buried. George Gordon followed Williams in 1856 with his wife Ellen, had moderately more success, but ultimately met a similar end. From a house perched high on a cliff overlooking the Williams River below, George was lured south on the pretense of providing medical assistance to someone in need. He was ambushed on the road, and as he fled his attackers, he stepped on a natural boulder, which is stained in a way that resembles a footprint. This is said to be a gospel reference to Jesus calling the Peter the rock on which he would build his church. George was killed, as subsequently was his wife Helen. The killers washed their weapons of blood in a natural stone basin that holds rainwater today. George's brother James would travel to Aramongo in 1864, eventually settling on the east coast of the island at Potnuma. James was the final missionary to be killed on Aramongo. He was killed at home in 1872. An upright stone marks where the blood ran after he was struck with a club. The killer, Nirimpau, fled north, but was eventually caught and killed by Christian converts in retribution. Nirimpau's body was hung from a tree along the coast, making it more difficult for his spirit to reach the realm of the ancestors. But in decaying, the murderer's blood poisoned the tree, which remains taboo, and is said to cause illness or even death if it is touched today. Among the vigilantes would have been Soso, a staunch defender of the faith whose battles are recorded by a pecked cupule site to the south of the mission building, now just a series of low stone and mortar stumps decaying in the bush. All three of these event landscapes need to be walked to be understood. They are literally a pilgrimage, though for me as an archaeologist, they are a visit, something traversed once or maybe a few times during the course of fieldwork. For many of the people who live in Aramongo, the martyr landscapes are part of everyday life. Men and women will walk past these places on their way to garden or to go fishing. Children will know the stories and will pass these places on the way to school, perhaps whispering a spooky version of the history to generate a reaction among their classmates. These kinds of landscapes are not limited to Aramongo, nor to Christian missionaries or European encounters. On neighboring Tana, the landscape at YCC, home of missionary William Gray beginning in 1882, is marked not primarily by the mission experience, but local conflict. Tana features two moieties, Koyometa and Numurukwen. Numurukwen was composed of subtle and clever magicians, while Koyometa featured aggressive and powerful warriors. The two sides were in competition that often broke out into warfare. During colonialism, the two sides acquired Bislama, Vanuatu pidgin, nicknames relating to their traits. Numurukwen became Sipi, the merchant's ship with its wealth and great variety of functions. Koyometa was Manwawa, the British man-o-war with its singular propensity for violence. Landscapes of conflict between the moieties are narrated on long walks through the steep terrain, where even quite recent sites are buried under meters of recent ashfall from the nearby volcano. Throughout southern Vanuatu, there are common stories of Watiktiki, a reference to the Polynesian demigod and culture hero Maui. Watiktiki fished the islands out of the sea, and here and there people will point to footprints formed because of the force required in these efforts. A particular stone was used for Maui to sharpen his magic adze in Futuna. Also in Futuna, Maui fought a cannibal monster while helping the monster's kidnapped victims to escape, one boy and one girl from each village. Maui raised the fringing reef on the north coast as a barrier to aid in the escape attempt. The monster cracked the barrier, forming the current boat passages. My PhD student, Rob Williams, has recorded other stories about ancestral villages in Futuna, but I haven't walked these paths myself, so they are not my stories to tell. In other cases, I've been shown and told a story, but told not to share it. Chiefs on Tana, for example, rely on special knowledge to bolster their authority, so it wouldn't do to give these stories to those of us without rank or title, professor or doctor not counting for much in these spaces. In addition to the more dramatic event landscapes and custom historicities, there's the role of walking as a form of community archaeology in these projects. In places where you can't simply load up a truck and drive straight to the site, equipment has to be carried by hand and on shoulders and backs. Sometimes the site is just down the hill from a village. Sometimes to get to the site necessitates a walk of several days, as was the case for getting from the airport at Ipota in Aramongo to James Gordon's house in the adjacent occupied village of Potnarvin. The daily trip to James Gordon's site itself often involved a chest-deep river crossing if there wasn't a canoe handy, and even when there was, the artifacts, paperwork, and soil samples got precedent over the archaeologists. Part of the fieldworkers' role in the project is to recruit people, usually, but not exclusively young men, to help with carrying the equipment across both long and short distances. And yes, there is something uncomfortably colonialist about hiring islanders at a low wage, by Western standards, actually well above average in the local context, to carry a bunch of white people's gear across beaches, cliffs, and through single tracks in thick rainforest. But these walks also offer opportunities. The fieldworkers and elders will narrate the landscape as we travel through it. This is not just sharing cultural knowledge with foreign researchers, but a critical opportunity for intergenerational knowledge transfer. This is crucial as young people in Vanuatu increasingly dream of lucrative work opportunities away from their home islands in Australia, New Zealand, and the resorts of the capital in Port Vila, though in this last case, these opportunities are basically mythical at this point. Knowledge holders have rare opportunities to pass on custom knowledge and stories, so these walks open a space for such engagements. The walks, either from place to place or to site each day, also help to integrate the team into the local community. Being in a village for a span of weeks means people see you navigating a regular pathway, much in the way that local people will access specific garden plots day after day during particular seasons. Just as locals will go to their gardens to dig yams, the archaeologists travel to the site to dig for artifacts. There will also be other chances for fellowship and conviviality, such as a particular mandarin tree, where we could stop each morning to gather fruit on the way to George and Ellen Gordon's house, high on a cliff overlooking the contemporary village at Williams Bay, formerly Dillon's Bay. Often our path would follow or intersect the regular pathways of village life. archaeology in these spaces becomes a spectator sport. Children walking home from school, gardeners bringing their produce home for the evening meal, or curious locals who had heard what we were doing would stop by an excavation trench or survey site to watch and to have a chat. Sometimes these chats would include long discussions about local history and heritage and what this archaeology thing was really about. Thus, people's everyday routes also helped us to raise awareness about the projects and archaeology more generally. For these experiences in southern Vanuatu, it seems the Bislama phrase, "Yumi must walk about," we have to walk, is more than a statement about how to get from one place to another. Rather, the imperative here suggests something more profound and indeed methodological about the collaborative archaeology done in these islands. The fieldworkers, elders, chiefs, and local labor are never simply getting the researchers to the next village or to site each morning. Rather, these walks are an integral part of developing an understanding of the island landscapes by walking through them, often in ways that are couched in custom historicities. Thank you very much for listening, and feel free to email me at the address on this slide with any questions or comments. Thank you too much.
Oops, lost myself. Okay, so long distance, thank you to James. Next up, we've got Shelona Klatzow with Conversion, Coercion, and Covert Raiding at the Platberg Mission Station, Eastern Free State, South Africa.
Okay, let's see if I can do this. Can everybody see anything?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. All right. The Platberg Mission Station was established in 1833 by the Wesleyan Missionary Society to Christianize and civilize the bastard population under the leadership of Captain Carolus Baekes. Now, they had lived at the Valhart River, I'll show you a map, and in a loose alliance with other groups there, particularly the Baralong, who are a very large group, living at Platberg on the Vaal, and 12,000 people moved to Platberg on, well, not Platberg on the Caledon, but the Caledon River Valley, to land granted to them by King Moshoeshoe of the Basotho. Once they got there, they immediately divided into 4 different mission stations, being Tubanshu for the Baralong, Umpakani for the Kaikarana, Lishuweni for Baron Barons and his bastards, and Platberg on the Caledon for Carolus Baekes and his people. Now, I suppose it's time to talk about terminology, because it is a different name to use. This is the name they used for themselves at the time. But bastards were basically the offspring of Dutch fathers in the Cape Colony, and either San or Khoi or slave mothers. And the slave mothers would have come from Indonesia, Malaysia, and places like that, because the Cape Colony was settled by the Dutch East India Company in 1652. So that's just a brief background to it. The bastards spoke Dutch. They had Dutch names like Johannes van Beek and names like that. And they had the more skilled jobs in the Cape Colony, and they had certain rights. But with those rights came obligations, and one of which was to form part of a commando duty and a commando system which would protect the Dutch East India Company's possessions from either enemy attacks from the sea or from groups in the interior. So they trained the bastards to ride horses, to use flintlock muskets, as you can see in this this illustration. And they formed a sort of a fighting force, a commando system. As the 18th century progressed and the 19th century started, their rights sort of dissipated and the obligations became more onerous. And they decided to leave the colony, and they crossed the colonial frontier eventually into Transylvania, where they were joined by many other groups of destitute people in the interior. There were wars in the 1820s, which I don't have time to go into, which created a domino effect of people raiding other people. And so they were joined by destitute groups. You can see he's quite a natty dresser here, drawn by Charles Bell. Now, they were a highly mobile group of people. They were pastoralists, and they crossed the colonial frontier with their flocks of sheep and goats, herds of cattle, and the more prosperous had wagons with which they would carry out their economy, which was based on hunting and trading, and now and again raiding. And so the wagon was essential part of their equipment, as was actually the commando system, although they hated it. So that is a brief description of who these people were. Now, Platberg was described firstly by the French missionaries who visited 3 years after its inception. And here you can see from the Google image, there's a stream, which we'll mention, it's a deep gully. They placed Platberg more or less against the western arm of the Platberg, a berg being mountain. A lot, I think, of the mission station has been plowed over, but the section nearest the mountains have been preserved, luckily for us. Now, it was a very unstructured village, and the first, and I'm afraid to say only depiction we have of Platberg was by James Backhouse, a Quaker missionary who visited in 1839. And you can see from this, when he drew most of the mission stations in the Caledon River Valley, many of which were enclosed, they had walls, fences, gardens. You can see Platberg in 1839 has none of these. The mission area would be the three buildings at the sort of top of the screen. I don't have a pointer. I don't know if you know. So, and there's a range of different houses here, sort of gently moving down slope. There were hartebeest houses, mat huts, and some round houses. We call them rondavels. They've got a thatched roof and they're round. But it's quite difficult from this particular picture to see exactly what they were. Now, most missionaries really were very interested in enclosure, in enclosing. Okay, this is a hartebeest house. Sorry, it has a sapling framework, and it is then covered with reeds and sometimes plastered. And there's even an opening for a fire. The fire would normally just keep them warm in winter. They would cook outside. Now, the organic nature of Platberg changed under the sort of missionary zeal and enthusiasm of the Scottish missionary, the Reverend James Cameron, who laid the village out in a very grid-like manner with streets crossing each other at right angles. Here we have a plan. This plan was painstakingly put together by Professor Amanda Esterhazen of the University of the Witwatersrand. You can see the mission complex. There's 2 buildings in the mission complex are enclosed, and the chapel, which is roughly cruciform in shape, is not enclosed, which stands to reason because you want it open for everybody to come and worship. The enclosures are there 2 very large orchards. The missionaries brought peach trees, almond trees, pomegranates, roses, and the like. people's kitchen gardens were enclosed. Some of the houses are open onto the main street, and some of the streets are visible. To the far left, the outline there is a plowed area, and the rest we don't know exactly what it looked like. So you can see now how he changed it from that sort of very organic village to something very structured. And to them, to the missionaries, Platberg was a sacred Christian area in a sea of heathenism and wilderness, which of course they really hated. Now, this is an illustration of a mat hut, which I mentioned. More to the point, the missionaries encouraged everybody to build rectangular houses. And the highlight, I think, of the Reverend Cameron's time at Platberg was that he helped to build a 3-bedroom structure, a rectangular building, mud brick house for Captain Baiki. The rooms was divided into functionally specific rooms, a parlor, a kitchen, and a bedroom. And for them, a kitchen was where you cooked. It was a private matter. You ate in the parlor. It was also private. The bastards, many of whom had a Khoi background as well, preferred to cook outside. And this shows a Khoi settlement in the Makwaland, where they're cooking their food outside, protected by a cooking shelter of reeds, but cooking shelters could be brush, stone, or something else. And it was a very communal affair. And what we did find at Platberg and excavate was a sort of a meter in diameter structure, which had foundations on 3 sides and mud bricks that was kept by a mud brick sort of disintegrating. They sun-dried mud bricks. So it would have been protected from the prevailing winds. I don't know that it had some sort of roof on it. We couldn't see. The entrance is closest to us on the slide. So what this is saying is that the Platberg people were actually sort of reverting to what was either comfortable or traditional for them, which was more communal and external cooking shelter, close to a hartebeest house, and also close to a mud brick structure as well. So we're getting a mixture of architectural traditions here as well. Now, moving on to dress, this is another part that the missionaries insisted on. So they encouraged people to build rectangular houses and live in a so-called civilized way. But they insisted that everybody who converted into Christianity dressed in European dress. And if you went to chapel, you had to be dressed in the correct way. So what we find here, well, what we can see here, this is from the French missionaries who stayed quite close by to Platberg. They had a mission station for the Basutu. You see that he's wearing very European style clothing. He's got a flintlock musket over his shoulder, as well as what could be a springback, I don't know. A hat probably made in the colony, trousers, probably leather, and very rough leather shoes, which we called veldschoen. Now, underneath his hat, I don't know if you can see, but he has got a scarf tied there very tightly. And the way that they tied what they called a duk would have been, they would signify their allegiance to one group or the other. So it was some sort of traditional dress that they were bringing in themselves. In the one hand, he's holding a nopkeri, which is mostly used by Bantu-speaking people, not exclusively, but mostly. And so the fact that he's using that as well is another part of the blend of cultures, dress, and everything else. What is interesting is that he's walking between, the missionaries are placed in between a rectangular structure, a dwelling with a chimney, and a mat hut on the other side. So that's also of interest. Now, what we find is that the women used to go to chapel in their cotton dresses, probably printed in Manchester, and they would be piously dressed. Many men would also, and women, would wear a kaross, which is a sheepskin or jackal skin cloak. The missionaries refer to these as stinking, dirty karosses, so they didn't really approve. This is a painting of the Lishueni chapel, and people at worship all sort of piously dressed in the correct outfits. Otherwise, as I said, they wouldn't be allowed into chapel, nor would they be allowed to be converted. And some seem to have karosses on as well. This was another part of the coercion, as it were. Now, Platberg itself, another Google image, and you can see the magnificent landscape actually, but what is interesting is the mountainside around it, which was wild and untamed as far as the missionaries were concerned. And again, the Platberg itself was enclosed. It was very much a Christian sacred area that the missionary was in charge of, well, sacred affairs. The captain was in charge of secular affairs, and there was often tension between the two over who was in charge over various matters, because obviously there isn't a neat dividing line between secular and sacred. But what we find from the Reverend Cameron's journal, which luckily I have seen and transcribed, is that people used the mountainside. So he talks about a convert in his society, in the Wesleyan society, who enticed people from the church to go into the mountainside, beyond the sacred boundaries of the mission station, into the hillside. And she practiced rain-making rituals, which of course was absolutely upsetting to the missionaries. The Reverend Cameron promptly expelled her. But what she'd done was she'd apparently mixed up fragments of hymns and scriptures mixed in with other traditional chants, and she performed these ceremonies in the hillside. Now, why I found that of such interest is that 2 kilometers away is a cave I excavated called De Hoop Cave. It's really a rock shelter. It's about 46 meters long. And as you can see from here, there is no clear vision from Platberg to De Hoop. And there is no doubt that the captain and some of his people knew about the existence of this cave. I'm afraid these are very yellow photographs that were taken in the 1990s with a film camera. So you can see they've gone all yellow and horrible. Anyway, De Hoop is also very hidden. A popular modern poplar grove in front of it now. It has got signs in front of it that there would have been indigenous vegetation hiding it. It's not very obvious. And there's a great view from there over the surrounding plains, which is probably why it was chosen. It's got quite about a 4,000-year history of occupation, but we're interested in the top levels here. You can see there was a roof fall, and on top of that, people built a stone walling. The farmer knows nothing about the walling. He doesn't know who built it. His family have been there for 100 years or whatever, and they don't know anything about the actual walling. But the upper levels have got a mixture of Basotho pottery, some stone tools, lots and lots of peach pips, and clay cattle figurines, and a few other metal objects. And also, and more importantly, rock art. Now, as I say, this is traced by Sven Utzman, who was at the time at the Bloemfontein Museum Rock Art Unit. He has identified these finger paintings as being Corona in origin, Now, the Korana were a very big raiding group in Southern Africa at the time, and they would go to caves not to live in, but in fact to conduct rituals and ceremonies, as well as to hide raided cattle and themselves from the pursuing armies of either the colonial army or Boers or whomever they had raided. As I said, everybody raided. The Boers, maybe not the British colonial authorities, but everybody else in the area took part in raids. And it was a way of replenishing your herds and whatnot. So, but this was part of, he would say, a magical identifying ritual where people would sort of come together, and it was a very important part of the Korana raiding strategy. You can see the standing figure on the left has got a cloak, a kaross on, and the one figure on the horse possibly has a gun. It is possible, Sven says. Anyway, now that is very interesting in the cave. And although we cannot say that this would have been done sometime in the 19th century, obviously with horses and guns, because that's when they arrived. We've got some neat time periods where when they were in the area, horses and guns in the area. During the 19th century, peach pips definitely only from 1830 onwards. The floor is just littered with peach pips. And the idea is that with the Platberg people living in so close, there's no doubt that the captain knew it was there. They would have known that Korana raiders might have used the cave. And there's no doubt that the Platberg people raided themselves. They took part in raids with other people as well as on their own. We have two records from the Reverend Cameron's journal, or two incidents that he records of them going out to raid before 1850 and after 1850. Official documents record them raiding on a regular basis. So what I propose in this instance is that they possibly brought cattle back to the cave and hid there whilst trying to escape detection and from the pursuers. They also possibly took part in these rituals with other raiding groups or on their own, as with the rainmaker. So rituals could have been for raids, rainmaking rituals and the like. And so that brings us sort of to conversion. How successful were the Wesleyans at Platberg? And the conversion rate remains incredibly low during the time that the 33-year occupation as of Platberg as a mission station, because in 1865, everybody had to leave the area because it became part of the Boer Republic of the Free State. So nobody else, and especially the Wesleyan missionaries, were kicked out because they taught the people how to read and write, and that was absolutely taboo as far as the Boers were concerned. So there's another little bit of the archaeology here. Lots of nice alcohol bottles. Again, that was not entirely taboo, but the Wesleyan missionaries really tried to encourage the people not to drink. If you were a member of the actual society of the church, you were not allowed to drink. Other members who weren't yet members of the society were allowed to drink, obviously, and brandy wagons were a regular occurrence on the station, brought in by traveling traders, peddlers. So we've got a case gin bottle at the top and some other alcohol bottle bases and a rim at the bottom there. In fact, the Reverend Cameron suspects once that they arrive at chapel drunk. So the conversion rate remains low, and my title's now all mixed up with conversion, coercion, which is trying to persuade them to not to drink. And in fact, the one missionary destroyed a brandy barrel, and everything ran onto the ground, and persuaded the trader to set up a store in the village as long as they didn't ever sell alcohol again. So, which they apparently took him up on his offer. And that was another way of controlling the people as far as that's concerned. So I think the missionaries at Platberg, their greatest success was possibly teaching the population how to read and write. And I don't have my time, so I've really rushed through it to be in my 18 minutes. That's it. Thank you. Wait, now what have I got to do again? I'm going to stop sharing.
There's just the red button at the top.
There we go. Okay, if I can get my mouse to work, I shall. Okay, try and do it, but it's really been difficult. Okay. I can't find my mouse. Where's it gone? Oh, there it is. Back again. Okay,
Thank you so much. All right, so now our third paper is by Olanrewaju Lasisi, and is entitled Political and Religious Landscapes of Conversion, Movements and Ritual Dramas Among the Ijebu of Southwestern Nigeria.
Thank you for that. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Oh, good.
It is showing us your notes at the
You
moment.
know what? Oh, okay, with the notes.
Yeah.
Okay,
I mean,
again. Okay. How about now? Is it good now?
So now we're in just the main PowerPoint screen.
Oh,
And it's not like playing the slideshow, but we can see your slides. So
okay. I don't know why that's happening, but
yeah, sometimes it gets stuck, I feel.
okay, I'm gonna stop it again and try it one more time.
Okay.
I usually have this problem when I'm working with two screens, that for some reason it never understands which one it has to show and it ends up showing the wrong one. But don't worry.
Oh, maybe because I'm using two screens, I guess. That might be something, but let's just see this time around. The same thing? It's okay.
It's showing the notes, but
Yeah, it's fine. The notes is just the next slide. So I think, but can you see two maps overlaying one another? You can see?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, so that's my main slide. So I wouldn't know why it's doing that. Oh, okay. What about now?
Oh, yeah, that's great.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
yeah.
Very good.
Okay. So the title of my paper today is Political and Religious Landscapes of Conversion, Movements and Ritual Dramas Among the Ijebus of Southwestern Nigeria. I will start off by talking about the Ijebu Atlantic trade routes, hegemony, and its scramble in the colonial period. The Ijebu Kingdom is situated 10 miles north of the Lagos Lagoon. It is strategically located near the Atlantic Ocean and was a nexus country between the coast and the Yoruba interior during the Atlantic trade. They controlled the trade route for many centuries. One reason for this longitudinal control is the construction of massive city walls. While many Yoruba towns have such enclosed city walls, the Ijebu walls cover more space and have more depth, up to 180 kilometers in circumference and about 10 meters to 20 meters deep at some locations. This monumental enclosure posed more challenges to traders who may want to circumvent it in order to reach the Yoruba interior. The kingdom also had 16 towns known as hegemonic towns surrounding the entire kingdom. They pitched their tents around the enclosure gates into the kingdom. This made it difficult to enter for people who would not contribute to the economic enterprise of Ijebu. The Ijebus lost control of the trade route when the British administration established the Lagos colony and introduced new political systems to the protectorate. Many Yoruba towns yielded to the British colonial administration. However, the Ijebu kingdom was recalcitrant to the point of engaging with the colonizers in an act of war. This would become the beginning of the disintegration of Ijebu architecture, for which is intricately tied to its commerce and economy, governance, and religious life. From the second half of the 19th century, they started closing the trade route and going against the regulations of the British colonial government to open it. Ijebu realized that the foreign government is a threat to their monopoly, hence their frequent hostility towards them. During these periods of hostility, the Ijebus identified Christian missionary agency with the British government. The two foreign political and religious powers were faced with hostility and resistance alike from the Ijebus. Ijebu as a landscape of conversion and resistance. The Ijebu kingdom was adherent to their traditional religion and not willing to embrace foreign religions. One of the first attempts at conquering Ijebu traditional religion was in 1849, when Reverend D. Indera arrived at the Bight of Benin. He was frustrated by the resistance of the Ijebus to the gospel preached. Resistance to early missionary works, particularly in Ijebu, was fraught with violence against the preachers of the gospel. They had this idea of resistance accurately depicted in their proverb that says, and I quote in indigenous language, Ijebu ajoji kowo, ajoji toba wo belu wuro, adie bolale, which means foreigners are not allowed to enter Ijebu. Any foreigner who enters in the morning will be used for ritual sacrifice at night. The Ijebus were adherent to the traditional custom, even in the face of colonial encumbrances. By the late 1870s, few foreigners had been able to penetrate Ijebu, but with no success at building any church nor mosque. One of the few successful missionaries to penetrate Ijebu kingdom was James Johnson in 1878. He wrote that even, and I quote, a native missionary visiting the place from Abeokuta in the interest of mission work was thought to have been fortunate to be able to return home alive. Meanwhile, the majority of the Yoruba hinterlands and colonies of Ijebu, including Remo, Iperu, and Ikodu, had accepted both Christianity and Islam by the 1860s. Church missions were established at Ikodu and Remo in 1854, Iperu 1866, and Shagamu in 1878. Although these four towns were tributaries to the Ijebu kingdom, they were not enclosed by the Ijebu walls. This reinforces how the Ijebu kingdom waged war against the colonizers through their landscape design. The enclosed Ijebu towns were the last pre-colonial Yoruba cities to bend to the British colonial rule and the foreign religious missions. This was during the Anglo-Ijebu War of May 1892, when the British soldiers and some recruited Hausa men attacked Ijebu-Ode, the capital city, after killing many Ijebu army at the southern end of the wall. The British force marched to the capital city, Ijebu-Ode, and burned down the annex palace, Ijebu. For the first time, Ijebu was conquered because their wall was penetrated. Ijebu was brought to its kneel as they watched their palace burn to ashes, while their king had already exiled to Epe, a colony of Ijebu. In the aftermath of the fall of Ijebu, Reverend J.B. Wood in January 1893 wrote that Ijebu has given in to a superior force, and the country, which for so long has limited and trammeled trade of things and tried to keep the gospel outside its border, is open now both to the trader and to the evangelists. Similarly, Reverend T. Arden, while grieving about the death of a missionary in Ijebu, he wrote, and I quote, "Since I wrote to you last, many things have happened. The road to the coast, which was then closed, has been opened by the British government, and we trust that from henceforth, the trouble resulting from the Ijebus closing their roads since the commencement of the mission here will cease." After the expedition, Islam and Christianity alike deemed it fit to spread their teachings. Reverend Isaac Oluwole, a native evangelist, attested to the fact that there was no single mosque or church in the Ijebu kingdom as at June 1892. But by November 1892, after the expedition, the first mosque in Ijebu was erected. By March 1893, there were 6 more. While the Christian missionary agencies were the ones faced with hostility from Ijebu since 1850, it appears that Islam kicked off quicker in the scramble for Ijebu kingdom. Although Islam was introduced into Ijebu in 1879, the building of the first mosque happened only after the expedition on a piece of land given to the Muslims by the new British-friendly Ijebu king, Oba Tunwashe. The construction of the first set of mosques in Ijebu kingdom had a huge implication to Ijebu traditional religion and the itinerary of their ritual dramas. Now I turn to conversion and resistance by the architecture of ritual. The building of mosques in Ijebu did not only challenge the Christian missionary agency to step up in the conversion mission, but it distorted the architecture of Ijebu ritual. By architecture of ritual, I imply the built structures and spatial paths followed during traditional ritual ceremonies. This ceremony mostly happened within the palace complex. So this is what the palace complex looks like today. The Ijebu Royal Palace complex played more role than being the political or administrative center. It is also the religious headquarters of the entire kingdom. This is the same place that welcomes all the Agemo priests from their location outside the capital city for the annual ceremony. It is also the ritual ground for Ojowu festival, as well as Oro ceremony and other rites. The ritual function of the palace can be gleaned from the palace appellation, Itooro Palace, which means Itaoro, the courtyard or front yard of Oro, an ancestor spirit. During all of these ritual ceremonies, the ritual priests have constant ritual movements from their own shrines to the palace temple. For example, the Ojowu deity has both male and female counterparts. The female counterpart, known as Obìnrin Ojowu, enters the palace ground from the northeast corner of the palace at Ijebu. The male counterpart comes from the southern end. The ancient Ijebu kingdom paid particular attention to astronomy. Hence, the movement patterns by the priests were astronomically aligned. Archaeological excavations at the palace complex revealed the first evidence of a sundial in Yoruba archaeology and West Africa at large. The shrines of the Ojowu deity also have compass marked to the ground to point to direction in which the deity must be placed and which path it must take to reach the palace. The male counterpart of the Ojowu has its shrine about 200 meters due south of the royal palace. It must follow through a gallery of a neobardial leaves, Igi Akoko, to a thick tree at the palace where the ceremony starts. The planting of Igi Akoko in ancient Ijebu was for navigation that aligns with cardinality. The priest of the male counterpart of Ojowu needed to walk along the north-south trail to have his offering accepted by the Ojowu deity. This movement across the landscape was threatened when mosques were built after the expedition. These mosques became, particularly this one here, there's a mosque between, so this is the palace and the shrine. So there's a mosque in between the two structures. So this mosque became the first building between the Ojowu shrine and the palace. It was strategically placed to truncate the practice of ritual and distort the orientation of Ijebu architecture of ritual. This stratagem gave Islam in Ijebu much power, and many natives turned to Islam. Despite the spread of Islam and Christianity and the urban process of road constructions, new buildings along the architecture of ritual, the ritual priests during the yearly ceremonies in Ijebu are still very rigid in their practice and devise other means to see the architecture of ritual in the face of such colonial modernity and urbanization. For the female counterparts of the Ojowu, the priest must march into the palace from the northeast corner of the palace complex here, of the palace annex, known as Ijebu. However, there is now a major road separating the palace annex from the main palace. The priest was confronted a few years ago when he was asked to enter through another gate after they closed up the northeast gates with a continuous fence, which you can see here. He declined and followed the footprints of his forefathers, and then another gate was placed at the corner for him to walk in. Upon entering, there is a small shrine with markings on the wall to direct him of where to go within the palace. His next stop would be to meet with the male counterpart coming from the south end of the palace. The priest of the male counterpart of Ojowu, with the mosque obstructing his ritual movement, takes a detour easily to the front of the mosque and navigates to the south-north trail until he gets into the palace. The northeast and the south gate are the only two gates whereby all Ijebu priests, including the Alagemons from the countryside, the Oro, and the Ojowu practitioners from the capital city, must enter into the palace. All these ritual movements must have not changed since the pre-colonial period through to the colonial times up to this very present moment. I now turn to archaeology to show the antiquity of such rigid resistance demonstrated by the Ijebu priests through space and time. As part of the Ijebu archaeological project I direct since 2017, my team and I excavated parts of the ancient palace complex. Excavation at the palace court revealed an effigy of Ijebu ancestor spirit, Agemo. Beyond the aesthetics, artistic, and political function of these pavements is its mnemonic inscription of a ritual map. This map is the same with the ritual movement of the Ijebu priest on the palace ground today. It has become clear as to why they were unwilling to alter their ritual movements despite the pressure imposed by colonial modernity and urbanization. It shows that despite the conquest of Ijebu in 1892, the sporadic spread of foreign religions, and the conversion that follows, the Ijebus resisted and are still resisting through seeing the landscape the same way they have always perceived it. They are unwilling to change this view despite the new roles played by the same landscape. Conversion in Ijebu has been termed elsewhere by the late British anthropologist John Peel as some sort of Africanization of Christianity, because churches became hybridized form of traditional and foreign religion. Similarly, Ijebu kings who converted to Islam still engage in Ijebu traditional rites of kingship installation and annual festivals that continued an age-long tradition. Indeed, The Africanization of Ijebu foreign religion and the continuity of Ijebu traditional religion through the strong adherence to the architecture of ritual are all subtle and an ongoing form of resistance to conversion. Thank you.
Muted. Thank you so much, Olanrewaju. That was great. I'm up next, so let me share my screen. Okay, so hopefully you can see my slides. Good. Okay. So again, I'm Johanna Pacyga, and my paper is entitled Taking Root, Catholic Conversion, Movement and Placemaking in 19th Century Senegal. The 19th century saw a reformulation of missionization strategies deployed by the Catholic Church and a shifting of attention towards Africa. In colonial Senegal, the French Puritan fathers mobilized ritual movement across the landscape as an integral part of their strategy for conversion, likely drawing on the tradition of medieval Christian pilgrimage and the florescence of Marian devotion and shrine visitation in the 19th century. These embodied practices also served as a potent mode of colonial place claiming and making. Now, this paper argues that rather than a mere visual manifestation of being converted, that pilgrimages, feast day processions, blessings of the mission place, and even simply passing by shrines or religious monuments were regarded as doing the work of evangelizing through the very act of participation by missionaries, neophytes, and potential converts. On one hand, these acts of mobile placemaking can be regarded as a potent instantiation of colonial French hegemony, in which the pre-Catholic landscape, with its particular local history and spiritual significance, in which this was erased by French missionaries and remade into a didactic Catholic landscape, part of the infrastructure of colonial domination and oppression. And in line with this train of thought, the pre-Catholic landscape might be characterized as imbued with the spiritual tradition of the local population as a kind of static resource of religio-cultural conservation that resisted Catholic incursions and reframings. However, in the second part of this paper, I will argue that the story of the St. Joseph mission and the landscape in which it sat is less easily parsed, and in fact presents us with a case of ongoing landscape-based spiritual engagement and creativity that reveals opportunities and moments of overlapping and conversation between local religion and Catholicism between 1860 and 1930. The mission of St. Joseph was founded in 1863 by the French Puritan Fathers. The apostolic vicar of Senegambia, Alois Cobas, envisioned St. Joseph's as a new hub for Catholicism, located far from the impurities of major commercial and military colonial centers such as Dakar and Saint Louis. The St. Joseph mission was located in Ngazobil, which was a place of relative obscurity from both the Senegalese and French perspectives. It's located on Senegal's central coast, just north of Joal, which was the closest entrepot. Ngazobil means place of the stone spring in the Serer language, and its natural springs made it particularly attractive to scouts who identified the area as a prime candidate for a mission settlement based on its isolation from urban distractions, lending it a quality of tranquility and solitude appropriate for spiritual reflection, meeting God, and cultivating faith, on top of the fact that it was also materially well appointed for establishing a mission from scratch. Monsignor Cobas planned St. Joseph's as a brand new settlement rather than the installation of a mission in a pre-existing town, such as Joal, where missionary authority had previously clashed with local leadership. St. Joseph's gathered men, women, and children from across central Senegal, and potential converts arrived mainly as refugees fleeing warfare and famine in the interior Serer polities. Most did not have local roots, but the local population, broadly speaking, also belonged to the Serer ethnicity and religious tradition. And while missionaries insisted that the land they claimed had been unoccupied, the area had actually been cultivated by people living nearby, and its place name, as I mentioned in Gazabil, called out a natural spring, and this indicates a potential association with a water-based spirit in Serer religion. So this 1867 sketch map of the mission lays out the triad of sites within the property, which, other than the labeled mission structures, is depicted as being unoccupied land. So St. Joseph's boasted a large complex to the south where the Spiritans were based. A little over half a kilometer to the north, we have the convent enclosure, and north again, the village of converts, the village of Saint Joseph. So St. Joseph's mission presents as a key site of missionization and the experience of conversion in Senegal during the period. Their Spiritans emphasize conversion as a community pursuit, even within the Christian paradigm of individuality. And landscape-based practices of placemaking and spirituality anchored conversion to the material terrain of the mission, rendering Ngazubil as a place central to the missionary's success and theories of conversion as occurring on the physical terrain as well as the spiritual. One of the difficulties of any conversion project and of central concern to the Spiritans in Ngazubil is determining how to identify a sincere change in faith that will lead to ongoing growth of the religion in question. Missionaries were plagued by the uncertainty of knowing the hearts and minds of neophytes. How were they to be sure neophytes had truly become devout Catholics? How could salvation not only be given and attained, but known? How could heretical practices be reliably stamped out? At St. Joseph's, Spiritans relied on a combination of observable material and immaterial practices amongst neophytes. And interestingly, it was largely material practices that were usually identified as evidence of non-conversion, particularly early on, such as the use of talismans or household charms. Observable but intangible actions by neophytes were the key element through which, especially the early Spiritans in Ngazubil, tracked the embrace of Catholicism and movement towards conversion. Ways in which knowledge acquisition of and commitment to Catholicism through commitment to the Catholic community were expressed included things such as learning prayers and the catechism, attending mission schools, welcoming interactions with missionaries, attending Sunday Mass and feast days, achieving the sacraments, converting family members, and finally, participation in both ritual movements through and everyday engagements with the landscape. Faith-affirming practices reflected the acquisition of Catholic knowledge required for informed conversion, becoming Catholic by participating in community-based activities linked to conversion, and ongoing engagement with the mission place and broader landscape in a way that continually inscribed Ngazubil as a place of Catholicism and reaffirmed the act of conversion as ongoing faithfulness experienced and made visible in the physical world. From earliest days, missionaries and neophytes laid claim to the land around Ngazubil through ritual blessings, processions, and pilgrimages, ignoring for the most part prior spiritual significance attributed by locals. A series of landscape-based traditions were initiated, and a rhythm of annual movements through the mission property, fields, and forests was established. And this is to say that conversion was certainly considered a spiritual shift that occurred for each individual internally, spiritually, but it was also something brought about and nourished by a specific suite of communal embodied practices that played out over the material terrain of the mission. This included claiming that terrain as a place of Catholic conversion. And 4 types of religious movement worked to this effect: blessing mission structures, ceremonial processions, pilgrimages, and daily religious encounters. On January 28, 1863, Monsignor Cobes performed the mission's first mass. He then blessed the land of Ngazobil in order to consecrate it to God under the auspices of the patron saint Joseph of the settlement. And this was only the first instance of blessing the land, and the benediction of subsequent structures that were erected on it became a routine event in the years that followed. The first missionary sisters to live in Ngazobil arrived in May 1864, and they celebrated their arrival by joining in a devotional procession through their property. The sisters sang psalms while priests blessed the physical space and structures of the convent. And the importance of having blessed their home base of evangelization was regarded as critical to performing missionization and setting the scene for conversion efforts. Related to blessings that claimed the mission property as such, processions, which were both spiritual in nature, but also incredibly visible and potentially social embodied practices, were also undertaken to protect the entire property and its inhabitants in times of peril. In the 19th century, a series of epidemics swept across Senegal, and the first recorded near Ngazobil was a cholera outbreak in 1869. In response, the Spiritans decided to bless all residents and the entirety of the mission property, piece by piece. On June 16th, everyone gathered under a giant baobab dedicated to St. Joseph, where Monsignor Cobes blessed a statue of the saint, which had been installed there as part of a shrine. The next day, everyone processed from the main mission quadrangle to the village, where Cobes blessed each household and every single structure. So each person in each building. And then finally on the 18th, Cobes blessed every built part of the mission proper with holy water, and Father Renew did the same at the convent. This methodical movement through the mission in tandem with benediction, connecting its different nodes through movement and the physical blessing of each element and person, was central to how residents countered danger, as well as how they constructed a religious landscape imbued with divine power that helped them to do so, to counter that danger. Religious processions were also integral to living conversion and continually imbuing the landscape with religious significance. By the late 19th century, at least 20 annual processions were integral to St. Joseph's liturgical calendar. An account from the 1890s describes a 5-kilometer-long procession of song and prayer in which priests and villagers dressed in white robes processed along the tree-lined roads of Ngazobil, which were festooned with palm fronds, banners, bunting, and canopies. In 1929, Mother Gonzague described the annual celebration of Corpus Christi as one of the most notable events in all of Senegal. Again, the procession route was richly decorated and a great number of colonial officials attended. Affective ties were fostered through prayerful and celebratory processions that connected residents to the land, to the essential place that was the mission of St. Joseph, as well as to each other. And by joining together in both times of fear and celebration, relationships were solidified and community was formed through inclusive ritual practices. To this day, feasts such as St. Joseph's Day include processions around the Old Mission. These celebrations gather not simply the local community, but serve as a means of gathering the broader regional Catholic community together, both ritually at Mass and through formal processing, but also informally, socially, at the after party, as it were, which includes feasting, dancing, and catching up with old friends. The social cohesion element of these events is inextricably bound to their spiritual function, critical to the entrenchment and preservation of a small but thriving Catholic community in Senegal. Historically, scripted religious movements through the landscape also included short pilgrimages. In 1866, a shrine to the Virgin Mary was built in a grove of baobab trees north of the mission. Monsignor Cobes wrote, "In the midst of our hardships, we seek consolation at the foot of Our Lady of the Seven Sorrows. We carried the statue to one of the baobabs near the village. It is a delightful place. The pilgrimage was made with great contemplation." A few months later, residents returned in pilgrimage to the grove after blessing agricultural fields against pests and blight. The climax of that pilgrimage was an open-air mass. And the enshrinement of the Virgin Mary there set the stage for repeated religious engagement and imparted a holiness to that specific location and the entire route to reach it. Ngazobile was peppered with visual markers of Catholicism along pathways in the village center, as well as the Spiritum quadrangle and the convent. Kobes installed monumental crosses at key locations, writing, "I will plant some crucifixes in our fields so as to put our plantations under the guardianship of the cross and the merciful and compassionate heart of Mary." He also mentioned that those crosses would become sites of everyday pilgrimage for mission residents. These monuments point to how even walking to the fields for work or traveling to Joel for trade became injected with Catholic symbolism and engagement. This infiltration of daily life with spiritual meaning cultivated an experience of conversion that threaded faithfulness through the everyday, connecting religious holidays together through the mundane time in between. While missionaries emphasized the remoteness and emptiness of the landscape when they chose Ngazobile, it was not simply an empty stage for enacting evangelization and conversion, nor were missionaries the only ones pursuing spiritual connections through landscape-based practices. Rather, it is possible to consider aspects of landscape-based Catholic practice at the Mission of St. Joseph as having been legible and even specifically in conversation with Senegambian religion. Points of confluence emerge around the attention paid to shrines associated with large trees and grove features in both Serer and Catholic religious practice in Senegal. The majority of converts in Ngazobile, as I said, were refugees from the Saloum and Sine kingdoms, most of whom came from the Serer religious tradition, which acknowledges a single creator, Rug Sine. Serer interactions with the spiritual realm are made through ancestral and nature-based spirits called Pangul, who operate as mediators between humanity and Rug Sine, but are also their own entities with needs and desires. Pangul might be, in terms of their cosmological function, likened to Christian saints, although they were not understood as such by missionaries. Rather, the early colonial accounts make quite derogatory reference to fetishism, animism, and polytheism. Pangul are generally associated with a specific place, often a natural feature where the spirit had revealed itself, such as a sacred tree or a spring, if you recall, in the case of Ngazobile. Place is very significant in Serer religion, and the landscape was one imbued with spiritual belief, mythology, and practice. In the 1890s, priests destroyed a sacred grove and shrine adjacent to a convert's village near St. Joseph. Supposedly, the Catholic villagers were terrified of a small thorny tree called a pas, which was the favorite resting place of a Fangul who had taken the form of a snake. The Spiritans cut down the trees and burned the area, eliminating visible evidence of Serer religion in the village. Now, notably, the grove was located a mere 100 meters from the village chapel, and it's possible that the closeness of these differently religious sites may have been intentional on the part of early converts who built that chapel, reflecting overlapping religious practices, each of which connected with natural features and significant parts of the landscape, whether Catholic or Serer, or sort of the overlapping space in between. Despite their misunderstandings of Serer religion, missionaries were aware of some of its physical characteristics, particularly these arboreal sites. It remains unclear whether they drew connections between Serer and Catholic practice. However, Senegalese Catholic ritual from the mid-19th century onwards highlighted pilgrimages to arboreal shrines. I suggest this may have been particularly legible to Serer neophytes. During a severe drought in the 1890s, missionaries initiated weekly communal pilgrimages to the grotto of Our Lady of Lourdes to pray for the return of the rains, protection from locusts, and abundant crops. And their efforts were duly rewarded. And objectively, this practice, attending to the shrine of a holy intercessor with the aim of receiving blessings and material results, is not unrelatable to a wide range of religious practices outside of Christianity, including Serer religion. And this is not to say that Catholic and Serer religion mapped onto one another, but to point out that certain place-based religious practices might be considered mutually legible. Catholic pilgrimages, places of prayer, and processions created a landscape in which conversion was embodied and achieved through movement. At the same time, this practice may have been legible to those coming from a Serere religious tradition, and perhaps served as something of a bridge between the two that was reliably understood by neophytes going through conversion, and which materially anchored multiple modes of spiritual belief to the palimpsest landscape. If we return to one of the propositions of this session, which was to emphasize movement as a means of thinking through the constant construction of place in a way that is neither simply a landscape indexing the ritual past, nor a hegemonic reordering of spiritual life, but a creative ongoing project of spirituality anchored in the material terrain, we see potential legibility and overlap, not necessarily as syncretism, but as ongoing creative process and/or non-exclusivity when it comes to the intersections of faith and practice in Ngazobil. And finally, setting aside how Serere and Catholic practices may have spoken to one another, I want to end by returning to how conversion, this intangible experience or state of being, was cultivated through movement. Based on landscape analysis alongside ethnographic and archival data, it emerges that communal movement across the mission place served to gel the nascent religious community together. And at St. Joseph's, the very experience of moving through the mission place was incorporated into Catholic ritual very explicitly. Thus, the landscape was transformed into one steeped in Catholic belief through repeated acts of ritual practice, such as the benediction of mission structures, pilgrimages to shrines, and the blessing of agricultural fields. Beyond mere placemaking, these codified movements became a critical means of ongoing, terrestrially anchored and experienced religious conversion and generationally rooted belief, which continue to have resonance in local Catholicism today. Thank you. All right.
Thank you, Johanna. No, thank you. As you were hosting, so someone told you something.
All right, so our next up, we've got Emma Galaney with Navigating Icescapes in Nunansiavut, Missionization and its Wintry Discontents.
Hey, everybody. Hold on one second. Let me see if I can get this to work. It's showing you my notes, right?
Yeah.
How about now?
That's good.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much, chat coordinators and organizers, Pilgrim chat coordinators and organizers. Thank you so much, Johanna, for putting together this session. It's been so nice to hear about everybody's work on movement and mobility, and I'm excited to share some of what I've been thinking about with you. This paper will use archives and infrastructures to explore religiously minded movement and immobility from Moravian missionaries in Hopedale, Nunansiavut. From the mid-18th to late 20th century, missionaries colonized the coast of Labrador, constructing large complexes and evangelizing to Inuit, attempting to convince them to become settled and end highly mobile ways of life. The act of conversion, then, was partially predicated on immobility, on convincing Inuit to stay in one location for services, school, and a supposed settled civility. However, I argue that missionaries, while preaching settledness, are simultaneously using their movement to Nunansiavut as a marker of their own piety. Further, while seasonally immobile in their sprawling mission stations, they write obsessively about things in motion: mail, goods, people, the mission ship. Thus, navigating icescapes are acts of resistance for Inuit, but also acts of pure faith for missionaries. The strange and rugged icescape is not just a space for refusal of conversion. It is a material obstacle that can be conquered to prove both individual righteousness and collective success for the Moravians, a way to place a flag of Agnus Dei on the so-called uttermost end of the earth. Before I discuss missionization, I will give brief historical context to circumpolar exploration. Public fascination with the Inuit intersects with centuries-long interest in Arctic exploration, beginning with the search for a trade route through the Northwest Passage. In the second half of the 19th century, there was an explosion in polar expeditions, particularly disastrous ones, which often ended in death, starvation, or cannibalism. These tales were eagerly scooped up by newspapers, crafting an image of the Arctic as an inhospitable, resource-poor hellscape. Emblematic of these constructions is a quote from the sailing master of the ill-fated 1871 Polaris expedition, who, when he reportedly brought Inuit on board his ship, asked them, "Why do you have such a cold, bleak, barren, monotonous, rocky, icy, stormy, freezing country here, unfit for a white man or anyone else to live in?" These types of adjectives have stuck. I will now offer a brief introduction to Hopedale, which is where this paper takes place. Hopedale is one of 5 coastal communities that make up Nunatsiavut, the Inuit self-governing region of Labrador. Nunatsiavut is considered one of the most vulnerable places to climate change in the world. For 8 months of the year, its landscape is made up entirely of sea ice, the volume of which has decreased by 40% in the past 4 decades. Thus, depending on the season, Hopedale can look extraordinarily different. It is a dynamic land, sea, or ice scape. These scapes afford different forms of mobility, materiality, and subsistence. Missionaries maligned the 8 months of the year that the ice was frozen because it meant severely reduced supplies from Europe. The annual supply ship, the Harmony, was met with joyous exultation in the summer after months of hand-wringing and sometimes dangerously low supplies. Despite this, wintry ice scapes were and still are often preferred by Nunatsiavut because the sea ice makes it easier to travel between communities, as well as to fish and hunt. Before Hopedale was known as Hopedale or Hoffental, it was referred to by Inuit as Agvituk, meaning place of bowhead whales in Inuktitut, because of the abundance of whales that entered the harbor. Its geography is made up of rocky craters, valleys, and hills, and rough undulations of gneiss carved out during the Holocene, creating a coastal tundra environment. The Nunatsiavut coast is a lattice of ponds and lakes, atop mostly bare rock, veiled in dirt, lichen, and berries. This watery landscape gives way to a seascape, dotted with islands of every size and shape, some erupting from the ocean towards the sky, and others appearing almost as accidents of the tide. It takes well over an hour on speedboat to get from Hopedale to the edges of the outer islands, where icebergs sculpted by their ocean voyage from Greenland float past. This dangerous and complex Labradorian coast was characterized by French explorer Jacques Cartier in 1534 as the land that God gave Cain. Hundreds of shipwrecks, small and large, lie beneath the Labrador Sea. In Sir William Grenfell's 1934 text, The Romance of Labrador, he begins his description of Labrador with a chapter entitled The Pageant of the Rocks. The Labrador coast is he says, the Labrador coast is still one of the most bold and rugged in the whole world. The baseness of the rocks, their freedom from obscuring forest and turf, helps the long coast to tell its own geological story. Mother Nature has there taken off more than the usual amount of clothing, which she is wont to bestow on the land elsewhere. And the autographed story of the ages is so imprinted on her naked bones that those who run may read its thrilling pages, and the wayfaring man can enjoy the conceit of being for a while a veritable Sherlock Holmes. To know Labrador is to know her geology. Seldom elsewhere is the explorer's mind so forced to think of the very beginning of things. Both Grenfell and Cartier's early description of Labrador reveal a sort of awe and fear of the unforgiving ruggedness, but also its spatial and temporal expansiveness. Its aesthetics inspire the writers to think of a deep past, of something that feels to them to be genuinely originary and other, a land that itself could be considered a punishment from God. I will now provide a brief history of missionization in Nunatsiavut. The Moravian Church, known in Europe as the Unity of the Brethren, is one of the oldest Protestant denominations in the world, and the first Protestant church to establish mission stations. The first missionary trip to the Inuit winter sod house settlement of Agvituk, what is now Hopedale, was taken by Jens Haven in 1770. Haven wrote that the people of Arvitok are quite well dressed, but at the same time are proud, rough, and look murderous. Missionaries sought to build mission infrastructures where Inuit would live in the fall and winter months, near sod houses, hunting or whaling locations, so that their proximity could coax evangelization. The importance of Agvituk for those reasons, and for its importance in the trading economy, was not lost on early Moravian missionaries, who likened Hopedale to London or Paris within Inuit society. According to Hans Rollman, Moravians were the most prolific record keepers of all evangelistic groups and kept a detailed archive of their activities on the Labrador coast, which were then published in periodical accounts throughout Europe to raise profits for the church. By the mid-19th century, each major Moravian settlement on the northern Labrador coast, including Hopedale, included a two-story communal dwelling house, a church with a bell tower that could be tolled to attract people to services, and a dead house to prepare bodies of the congregation members who died, amongst other buildings. The larger buildings in these settlements often faced the sea, towards incoming ships and the ever-shifting sea and icescape. The Moravian mission complex buildings arrived to the coast in prefabricated pieces. Because there was so little timber in Labrador, the wood was imported over several years from Europe on the annual mission supply ship. Some of these etched Roman numeral instructions for how to adjoin pre-cut wooden beams are still visible today. Many of the early Moravian missionaries were carpenters by trade, and they helped erect these prefabricated buildings in the treeless landscape. These buildings, the persuasive infrastructures of missionary settledness, the place where missionaries spent nearly 8 months of the year practically in place, were only made possible through these ships navigating icescapes full of European timber as objects in motion, which was necessitated because of the otherness of the Arctic landscape, not equipped for architectures of conversion. The archival documents I draw from in this paper are primarily missionary diaries from the early 20th century. The colonial record is always both fractured and performative, but there is an epistemic intimacy when the flaws and fears of its writers are laid bare in diary form. The weather, first and foremost, is ever on the mind, visible in almost every single entry, no matter the frequency that they are written. It is as if when one sits down to write about what has gone on, it necessitates recording the temperature, wind, and precipitation. And the weather dictates much of what else is written. It is an obsessive production of the daily environmental conditions, an impetus that tells the ways in which these diarists may have been eager to understand, to write down, and to enumerate the climate. It is a way for the writer to put into words and make intelligible a chaotic climate that is not just an aesthetic observation, but one that brings with it very real danger. The repetitive and obsessive production of the weather, when read as an archival form that reveals the nuances and the affective dimensions of colonial agents, is a text of concentrated anxiety. Archives serve not only as objects or technologies of governance, but as sites that make transparent power relations and governing angst. For missionaries in Hopedale, this anxiety is on the surface. The desire to enumerate unpredictable and dangerous weather while they are immobile within the mission station, the fear and worry of little to no communication with anyone from outside of the community members during rough weather, and the dread that perhaps these entries might be the last ones made. The diarist wonders if the weather is preventing or allowing the mobility of people and the circulation of information, focusing on the ability to receive mail or goods by postman, on foot, or ship. The importance of weather in structuring how missionaries conduct their lives is emphasized. Diary entries range in frequency, sometimes daily, but never more infrequent than one entry per month. If the entry occurs at the end of the month, providing a sort of summary of activities, it will without fail begin with the weather and precipitation, and then devolves into a discussion of ice and sea conditions, with the success or poverty in the seal, fish, or fox catch. During the summer, when the harbor ice breaks up, the diaries also carefully log which ships have arrived or left and exactly who was on board. The weather in Hopedale is highly variable and reported by missionaries differently than the exact instrumental readings discussed by historical climatologists. From 1916 to 1922, the weather was characterized in a myriad ways, some of which are on this slide. The most common descriptor, thick, is often used in relation to the going, which is usually put in quotes by the diary writer. Thick weather can refer to fog, rain, or snow. It is a catch-all way to describe precipitation or conditions where there is little visibility. Going is a still used phrase which means mobility, to be able to move to and from different communities, or to be able to go to different areas for fishing, hunting, and trapping. It is the ability to leave the smaller settled area for elsewhere. The weather as a constant in the diary, then, can be read as an obsession with the mobility of goods and people as well. If archives are unconscious maps of the mundane, then the archives here depict a mundane that is centered upon isolation, anticipation, expectation, and an obsession with exactly what is mobile in the world. In July 1919, the entries of an entire month are almost wholly devoted to the way that the weather is and has been affecting the arrival of mail, a fixation with how or why it is delayed, an enumeration of what the mail has brought, 13 sacks of flour, being recorded because of its material certitude, something to physically grasp onto and tell oneself that they are missed or considered by people across the ocean. Further, one of the most biting entries in the Moravian missionary diaries reveals the way that mail service and its failures reflect the inadequacy of colonial administrators. When mail does not move through the Labrador coast to their complex, Moravians write in a furious and rather ungodly way. And the most jovial entries refer to the coming of the Harmony, the mission ship which brings goods from overseas, and also detailed the way that Inuit community members and missionaries alike rejoice when it arrives. In the periodical account published in 1903, we see how the missionary experience was translated for public consumption in Europe. An update from the Hopedale Mission Station reads, "Ye shall be my witness unto the uttermost parts of the earth. So said our Lord to his disciples just before his ascension. Our Labrador mission lies on the fringe of the uttermost parts of Arctic North America, where Mr. Peck of the CMS mission in Baffin's Bay reckons there are 8,000 Inuits still destitute of the light of the gospel. His map of these unevangelized regions shows these heathens are spread all along the northern coasts and islands. To evangelize successfully, then, requires traveling from Europe and to the fringe of the uttermost parts of the Arctic. Not only is this kind of missionary movement a demonstration of the lengths of the distance that they are willing to travel to spread the word of the Lord, it is also great material for a public that is curious about the alienness of the circumpolar north. It sells. To those who are born or raised or have spent significant time in the Arctic, it is home. At the same time, to those who are visiting the Arctic, it is an elaborate, value-laden, and almost mythical construction. In the Arctic winter, if one leaves their residence not properly outfitted, they will certainly die. There was almost no access to municipal or medical services and no communication with the world outside of the community during this period of 8 months of isolation, when climatic conditions are most dangerous or unfamiliar to someone who would be visiting the space. The winter is a long period of unknowns. And when the weather is most thick in the winter, one can open the door and be greeted by a completely white wall. You could be buried inside for literally weeks at a time. It can be oppressively isolated and monotonous. But in these archives, missionaries do not spare any ink on their remoteness, on their peripheryness, on their distance from the metropole. Part of the evangelizing mission is achieved through this travel to the periphery. And this perspective is not just that of the missionary. Explorers visiting Moravians consider them to be exceptional in their devotion to their decision to live in Nunatsiavut. In Gaythorne Hardy's 1911 text, Through Trackless Labrador, he writes that Moravian missionaries in Nunatsiavut were living lives truly beyond all praise, due to the extremity of the climate and the remote, trackless landscape. He goes on to elaborate that though Western Scotland and Labrador are of the same latitude, the differences of climate across the sea were enormous. The praise that Moravians received for their decisions to live and work in Nunatsiavut are directly related to the perceptions of the extreme otherness of the icescape and climate. Iceliness is close to godliness. Writing from within their interconnected complex made of European timber, the winter weather was something that prevented circulation of goods and people. And despite this, the archival obsession with the mobility of goods and people becomes most frantic in the winter. Missionaries construct the environment as one of awe, a geography of isolation, a constant referral to waiting, anticipating, hoping for a connection with other non-Inuit and Western places. This geography of isolation is explicitly remarked upon in the 1919 book by Eskimo Dog Sled and Kayak, written by Samuel Hutton, a Moravian missionary, who documents his journey to and from Labrador on the Harmony. He writes that he is journeying to the land which we call Lonely Labrador, where missionaries had lived their lonely life due to the freezing of ice 8 months a year. This loneliness then is weather dependent, sea ice dependent, the inverse of the celebrated connectivity that sea ice allows for Nunatsiavut Inuit. And the landscape, particularly the sea ice, takes on the social characteristic of loneliness. For missionaries then, their decision to live this lonely life, to travel to the uttermost ends of the earth, is one which proves their closeness to God. Though conversion is predicated on settling the highly mobile Inuit so that they remain close to the mission station, missionaries use and call upon the dynamic landscape in their diary entries, in the periodical accounts they are selling, and in the periodical accounts that they are selling, to signify their faith. Thus, navigating the icescape is not just an act of refusal of conversion for the Inuit, but also an act of trust in God for the Moravian missionaries. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Emma. All right, now we've got our penultimate presentation by Scotty Norman, Dancing, Trembling, and Chanting, Bodily Movements, Sacred Spaces, and the Enactment of Anti-Catholic Praxis in 16th Century Highland Peru.
Okay, thanks so much for this session and for organizing it. It's been so nice to hear. Sometimes I think we get pigeonholed into our own region, so it's been great to hear about other work scholars are doing in other places. So we're moving down to South America and moving back in time to the 16th century, and that's where we'll start. So the theme of chat this year is movement. And this session specifically considers religious movements and the places and landscapes of conversion. As Johanna was saying earlier, religious conversion is a notoriously difficult phenomenon to study archaeologically. How is the archaeologist supposed to determine or demonstrate internal personal shifts in belief through the objects and places left behind by those typically indigenous communities undergoing evangelization? And more broadly, how do religious leaders and practitioners instill or validate authentic belief through the creation of sacred places or movement through space, as with the case of pilgrimage? In this presentation, I approach movement and conversion through two distinct yet interrelated scales. First, I think about the intimate, personal, and ultimately bodily practices utilized in religious performances. These small-scale actions include dancing, chanting. Can you see my screen okay? Sorry. Okay, I got a notification. Dancing, chanting, trembling, and spirit possession, and are often performed either in celebration of a religious event or as the physical manifestation of being inhabited by an otherworldly entity. Second, I show how these bodily movements are indelibly linked to specific spaces and places. To dance and tremble in a Catholic church was imbued with a different meaning than to perform ecstatic bodily movements at the location of an indigenous shrine, at least in the eyes of European evangelizers. I thus entangle instances of bodily movement with placemaking and landscape to consider how indigenous communities concurrently enacted the role of good Catholic to Spanish authorities, while simultaneously resisting conversion during the 16th century Andean revitalization movement of Taquiancoy. And that is Quechua for singing or dancing sickness. A little background: when the Spanish invaded Peru in 1532, they unknowingly entered a landscape already scarred by factionalization. Left without a clear leader after the death of the Sapa Inca Huayna Capac prior to Spanish conquest, Francisco Pizarro arrived in the middle of an Inca civil war between the brothers Atahualpa, the King of the North, like Game of Thrones, and Huáscar. For the next 5 years, the Inca would resist Spanish control through a series of battles and skirmishes. Yet by 1537, the Spaniards had secured their control over the former Inca Empire, whose remaining lineages retreated to the jungles of Vilcabamba. While the Inca began to amass weapons in preparation for an imminent battle with the Spaniards, the Spanish were improvising governmental policy and evangelization as they dispersed throughout what is today Peru. The justification for Spanish conquest, at least nominally, was the mass conversion of native peoples and thus the salvation of their souls. Yet the extemporaneous nature of Spanish rule muddled the first attempts at mass Catholic evangelization, which were implemented by discrete groups of religious orders, each of whom was responsible for different regions and settlements. These orders, Dominicans, Franciscans, Augustinians, and eventually Jesuits, initially lacked oversight or standardization from the Spanish crown. As a result, incorporation or prohibition of native religious traditions into Catholic rites varied. In particular, the role of native Andean dances, an integral part of the pre-conquest Inca regime, shifted so that they were alternately fused or banned from Catholic religious ritual. Prior to Spanish arrival, costumed prescribed dances made up a central part of Andean and Inca religious performance. Many have argued that these dances initially manifested as ethnic representations of the self as a form of tribute to Inca rulers. That is, Andean ethnic groups would perform culturally specific dances with distinctive costumes, steps, and themes in their participation in Inca religious and political ritual. With Spanish colonialism, however, the subjectivities of the dances shifted so that dance troupes instead represented the other. In the first 2 decades of Spanish presence in the Andes, these dances were variably incorporated into Catholic rites. Since the Spanish also had a tradition of Christian ritual dancing, they initially accepted Andean dances, viewing them as a crude mimicry of Catholic devotion, particularly on important religious holidays like Corpus Christi. However, Spanish authorities soon recognized the integral role of dancing and procession in Inca politics. In 1551, the First Lima Council banned public displays of Inca religious practice, particularly those dances that were associated with ancestor veneration. As a result, Andean dances, which were once elaborately performed in public spaces, were relegated to clandestine operations undertaken in hidden locations or in the absence of Spanish authorities. For both Andean and Spanish groups then, the meaning of indigenous dance quickly became contextual. When performed in churches or church plazas on Catholic holy days, these dances were interpreted as imitations of Catholic devotion. But when these dances were performed away from Spanish or Christian spaces or without the presence of Spanish authorities, they were thought of as idolatrous by Spanish clergy. In the early colonial era, then, performance and dance thus became entangled with landscapes of conversions. In the 1560s, a small band of traveling Andean preachers reportedly set out from the Inca holdout of Vilcabamba and traveled throughout the Peruvian highlands, advocating for the rejection of Spanish traditions and a return to indigenous Waka worship. Waka is a word I'm going to use a lot. It means local deity, usually of the landscape. This movement, known as Taquiancoy, was considered by authors writing at the time to be the religious counterpart to the military uprising in Vilcabamba. Taquiancoy practitioners believed that their indigenous Wakas had suffered affronts by both the Spanish, who had destroyed many of them in their plunder campaigns, and by the Andeans themselves, who had shown them neglect during the conquest. The result of this neglect and destruction was retribution from the Wakas, who were resurrecting and poised to form armies to rise up and defeat the Catholic God, thereby returning the Andes to a perceived utopian time prior to Spanish rule. The reanimated Wakas were said to fly through the air and inhabit various individuals who claimed that they had been purified by Waka possession. Possessed Taquiangos would drink heavily and dance for days, often in ritually cleaned outdoor enclosures, specifically designated for Taquiancoy performances. Other practices were related to the rejection of Spanish traditions, including avoidance of Spanish foods, clothing, churches, and prayer. Takiangos repurposed Andean practices such as the use of red body paints, sacrifice of llamas and guinea pigs, and ancestor veneration. Some individuals even practiced outright rejection of Catholicism, manifested through the destruction of Catholic symbols and materials. Takiankwe consisted of both performances or standardized acts which follow cultural scripts, and performatives or semiotic acts that do or can make a change in the world by their execution and reception. An example of a semiotic act would be, I pronounce you married. By dancing, chanting, and falling into trances, Takiangos were not just acting like wakas, they became wakas, they were wakas. These movements were not just associated with anti-Catholic idolatry, but for Andean performers, they were literal embodiments of Andean religion, deliberately undertaken as a challenge to Catholicism. Performance and spectacle are integral not only to the creation and maintenance of political relationships, but also to the subversion of political norms, as is the case with Takiankwe. As a spectacle, Takiankwe would have drawn the attention of local participants and observers, and it was deemed radical enough to worry Spanish authorities. Now, performance and movement can be difficult to study archaeologically. Events themselves are often ephemeral, as is the case with dancing or possession. Yet, since performances generally transmit a message and are liminal and dangerous, they are structured by conventions and frames, ways of making the places, the participants, and the events somewhat safe. That is, performance has the ability to both establish and transform social orders and can affect change in both secular and religious realms. Archaeology is well suited to consider how architectural space would have structured movement and affected bodies. According to the Spanish priest Cristobal de Albornoz, who's shown in the drawing there, he spent much of his career extirpating Takiankwe idolatrous practices, and he wrote that Takiangos often performed in specially designed circular enclosures where they would feast, fast, drink, and dance. These enclosures became the stages for elaborate Takiankwe performances, during which Takiangos supervised the dances and simultaneously received offerings from those participants. In Alvarez's 1588 account of Takiankwe, he writes that adepts, quote, danced in groups, raising and lowering their legs and arms in a vigorous stationary march with clenched fists, moving their heads from side to side with each step and making a high-pitched sound, ooh, 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 ooh. And the GIF on the left on the screen there is the modern contemporary version of Takiankwe. It's called Danzantes de las Tijeras. So how can we approach landscapes of conversion and movement archaeologically? And more specifically, how can we study the 16th century Takiankwe performances typified by the ephemeral practice of dance? In the rest of this presentation, I integrate historical documentation with spatial analysis and excavation results at the site of Iglesia Chayoc, Ayacucho, Peru. Iglesia Chayoc conveniently means church over there. It was a Takiankwe center. I show how indigenous dances and movements at particular places at Iglesia Chayoc generated differential responses from Spanish authorities, and how this interplay shaped performative conversion and resistance during the Takiankwe movement. Iglesia Chayoc is an Inca to early colonial period residential and administrative site in the Chichasaurus Valley of Ayacucho, Peru. Data from historical documents and archaeological findings affirm that the site was founded in the 15th century, shortly after the Inca conquest of the region. The site is spatially centered on two structures at its center, a 33 by 9 meter by 9 meter Catholic church, which is the long structure in the picture there, and a 14 meter by 11 meter Inca structure, which is the sort of more rounded one immediately to the left. The site has at least 90 other structures in a state of remarkable preservation. These structures were built in three different forms: ovoid, rectangular with squared corners, and rectangular with rounded corners. Ovoid structures were the typical construction form for the Saurus, the local ethnic group, and may represent the more local portion of the site. Rectangular structures with rounded corners were the standard domestic household for the Inca, and rectangular structures with squared corners, of which there are only 10, make up the least common structure form, and all except one of these structures are located within a 100-meter radius of the central church. All of their access ways are facing the church, and it's likely that They were erected either concurrently or after that church was built. They're all oriented toward activities occurring in that central portion of Iglesia Chayoc. Most importantly for the themes of religious movement discussed here, there are two prominent open spaces or plazas, one to the north of the church and another, which I call the local plaza, hidden south of the Spanish religious center of the site. The church and central plaza, which is in that upper photo there, would have been the places where church masses, dances, baptisms, prayer, and funerals occurred, and was likely the Spanish religious center of the site. The central plaza and church are the most visible places at Iglesia Chayoc, centrally located in a depression where all other parts of the site would have been able to look down upon it and see what was happening there. Conversely, the local plaza, which is at the bottom there, that bottom photo, is invisible to the Spanish religious center of the site. It is circular and constructed into the hillside, making use of the natural arrangement of boulders. That plaza is consistent with the semicircular enclosures specifically designed for Taquiancoy. In 2015, I directed the Proyecto Arqueológico de Taquiancoy, or PATO, and my team and I excavated 19 units of 4 different types, 10 households, 5 patios, 1 central plaza unit, and 3 units in the central church. In general, excavation results demonstrated continuity in domestic households with some instances of entangled material assemblages, contexts in which objects of Spanish origin and objects of Andean origin interacted in spaces used by both groups. Excavations into public areas identified spaces which were used for performances and dancing. In our excavation of church burials, we found an array of interment practices which demonstrate a wide range of positions vis-a-vis Catholicism in Taquiancoy. The data provides evidence that the Andeans at Iglesia Chayoc were only variably participating in Taquiancoy, and that those participations were occurring at different scales and levels of visibility. The primary source documents that discuss Taquiancoy provide little information as to where the ritual drinking and dancing occurred at the site level, and the witnesses who describe these rituals often provide contrasting accounts. Moreover, the physical spaces where Taquiancoy was performed changed over the movement's lifetime and were variable between different settlements. In the earliest account from 1564, Taquiangos are described as climbing to mountain peaks and other places of importance in the landscape which were venerated as huacas. It was at these remote locations where the rituals were performed, thus allowing the movement to remain underground for the initial years of its existence. In the case of Iglesia Chayoc, there are 4 sites near the sacred mountain Harwarasu, Cuyucuncha, Cusmayro, Doce Corrales, and Alala. And you can see the structures there at Cuyucuncha. These sites contain Inca and Suarez structures and seem to be related to one another and to the mountain Huaca, though none have been fully investigated to assess their relationship to Taquiancoy. During the late 1560s and 1570s, when Taquiancoy was understood as a distinctive idolatrous phenomenon by Spanish extirpation priests, the documents affirm that these dances were undertaken in these circular outdoor enclosures that I've been mentioning. The local plaza was one such place where Taquiancoy practitioners enacted these performances. We excavated 2 units in this local plaza, one in the plaza itself, one in the ovoid structure that abuts the plaza. And both of those units presented vastly different results than the other household and plaza units. There were no activity contexts at all in these places, no hearths, no lithic debitage, no faunal remains, and only a few ceramic fragments, all of which were under 5 centimeters in size. You can see on the left in the screen there, those are the 2 biggest fragments of ceramic we have from this excavation unit. These results suggest that the local plaza and associated structure were either 1, not utilized for traditional domestic tasks such as cooking, or 2, that they were periodically cleaned, as is the case with preparing Taquiancoy performances. Moreover, this plaza was invisible to the Spanish ritual center of the site, as shown in the viewshed analysis I ran here through ArcMap. There are 2 contrasting aspects of visibility at Iglesia Chayoc, which broadly align with the 2 competing religious movements, Catholicism and Taquiancoy. Spanish authorities often constructed their churches atop or near places of Andean importance. In this way, religious officials could draw analogies based on sacred space. Andean peoples would not have to completely shift their worldviews, but only alter them to account for the new religion. The Spanish church at Iglesia Chayac is an example of this phenomenon, dominating the primary site entrance by its presence and visibility erupting out of the flat plaza. Conversely, it is likely that Taquiangos sought a completely different type of space for their performances, a space which had a high degree of invisibility. By selecting locations for performance that both had visibility of approaching individuals, but also were protected from being seen by these individuals, Taquiangos could practice their waka possessions, chants, and dances in private, covert ways, thus avoiding punishment. Finally, in the 1580s and 1590s, after the active campaigns of extirpation officials, the movement was driven underground and the performative aspects were enacted within domestic households. At Iglesia Chayac, we see little evidence of performance in these households. In fact, excavation results demonstrate that daily practices of domestic life were not drastically altered by either Spanish presence and Catholicism or Taquiancois. We found no objects or contexts that could be confidently associated with either religious tradition. However, given the dispersed layout of domestic structures at Iglesia Chayac, the interior spaces of these households would have been largely impervious to surveillance by either religious sect, and thus perhaps could have been a safe place or a space of resistance or agency for the families that lived there, not having to perform one or both religions all the time. The last religious space I'm going to talk about is the plaza north of the Spanish church. This is the central plaza, the Spanish center of the site. So one last way in which Taquiancoy performances can be inferred is through the punishments given to Taquiangos as documented by the priest Albornoz. At Iglesia Chayac, these included 12 Andeans who were bound, whipped, and had their heads shaved, and they were sent to serve in the town's central church. Albornoz also wrote that he, quote, found and discovered 32 idols of the curacas, which were publicly burned in the plaza. My team and I excavated a 5 meter by 5 meter unit in the center of the central plaza. It lacked most diagnostic ceramic and faunal remains. But during Taquiancoy, wakas were not only able to inhabit various individuals, but they were also considered portable. So the destruction of portable stone wakas, as was reported in the documents, certainly could have been possible in this area of the site. In this unit, we recovered 152 fragments of a brown waxy stone known as welded tuff, an igneous rock generated from explosive volcanic eruptions. If the stone were present in such high quantities across all units in exterior spaces, then I would expect it to be a natural part of the site's geology. However, no other exterior unit contained welded tuff. The presence of this type of stone in the plaza thus could correlate with Albornoz's overt destruction of wakas here. Almost done. Returning to our themes of movement and conversion, I suggest that Iglesia Chayac was a town in which Catholic performance and Taquiancoy performance coexisted. Yet the places where these processions, dances, and possessions occurred were distinct and deliberately selected. For Catholic authorities at this time, incorporating native dance into Catholic rites may have been a strategy, and these performances would have occurred in the central plaza north of the Spanish church. Additionally, punishment and destruction of native religious practices also occurred in this plaza, highly visible from all other parts of Iglesia Chayac. However, Taquiangos also performed at Iglesia Chayac in the local plaza, hidden from the eyes of Spanish authorities. While these dances, bodily movements, and processions may have had similar steps, themes, and chants, their enactment in different sacred places at Iglesia Chayac created a religious landscape that allowed for simultaneous veneration and rejection of Catholicism and adoration of local Andean deities. Thank you so much. And I will stop sharing my screen. I know we need to do that. Stop share.
I'm muted. Thank you so much. All right. So now our last paper is from Alexander Maneker, Regionality from Here to There in the Valley of Volcanoes, Southern Peruvian Andes.
Sorry, I was muted. Let me share that again. Cool. Oops, and get that into PowerPoint view. Cool. Oh, can you all see? Is that, oh no, you're not, I'm not sharing yet. Oh, dang. Screen 2. Cool. Can you all see the presentation now?
Yes.
Excellent. All right, let's do this. Thank you to chat organizers. Thank you to Johanna. It's a pleasure and a privilege. It's great to hear all these presentations and to think about all these things, as well as then be familiar with Andy's. So thank you, Scotty. So without further ado, let's talk about regionality from here to there in the Valley of Volcanoes, southern Peruvian Andes. The bus follows a road that enters the mountains close to where they rise from the Pacific coast. It plods and tumbles along on the dirt and gravel road carved into Andean mountainsides. Ascending beyond the Majes Valley, high into the southern Peruvian Andes, the bus passes through small towns composed only of a few houses lining the road. It steers through town plazas, markers of Spanish colonial past, products of the program of reducciones, involving efforts by the Spanish colonial state to forcibly resettle indigenous residents into nucleated settlements away from their pre-Hispanic village settlements, or yactas, and huacas, or sacred landscapes, as we heard, in order to craft imperial subjects. Along the ride, people shuffle on and off the bus. As we climb, the valley floor recedes below the steep cliff walls and leaves behind a view of the switchbacks that carried us upwards and along the mountainside. The evening shadow rises from the bottom of the valley, and soon in the dusk night, the lights of distant homes, excuse me, the lights of distant homes are visible higher in the mountains. The bus makes this journey once a day, leaving from the city of Arequipa for the nearby Andean highlands, tracing a circuitous path filled with twists and turns, rising and falling, negotiating the peaks and valleys of the Andes. It is an 11-hour ride to Indagua. The modern city of Arequipa has a population just under 1 million people and traces its roots back to 1540, when García Manuel de Cabral founded it to be a Spanish colonial and Christian urban center. More than 200 years later, motivated by urban reforms, Corregidor Joseph de Araña would take the multiple-day trek to visit Indagua, claiming years of unpaid tribute that was due to the crown, only to soon learn of local resistance to his regional authority along with continued ancestor veneration. A 600-page court case chronicles multiple years of struggle and belies the jarring and violent encounters that involved a series of efforts from colonial officials to not only acquire tribute, but to destroy local Andean cultural practices and most centrally reassert authority and subjugation of local Andean communities. As Spanish colonial officials first attempted to arrest the former cacique Gregorio Taco, a local merchant and leader of an ancestral cult who had renewed anti-tribute agitations, neighbors ran out into the streets in support of Taco, exclaiming their anger at the Spanish soldiers, including throwing rocks from slings at them and calling the soldiers Moors. While not an overt rebellion informed by segmentary forms of authority overlapping with notions of a decentralized colonial authority, local residents rejected regional Spanish colonial authorities, asserting that only the viceroy could judge Taco. The deceased ancestors, present witnesses of the past, were links among people on the earth, offering life and prosperity. Over the years, Spanish colonial officials and 150 armed soldiers would scour the landscape, taking indigenous residents as prisoner guides, tearing ancestral remains from ritual shrines, burning and hanging the bodies in the town plaza, causing great trauma and sadness to indigenous residents. The destruction of the ancestral inhabitants by Spanish colonial forces reflects how, on the one hand, Spanish colonial authorities could not comprehend a world with these bodies, assemblages, and places, while on the other, indigenous residents grieved a world without them. The court case, however, would eventually collapse as charges of idolatry associated with tribute non-payment crossed jurisdictional boundaries between church and state. Reaching the edge of the Majes Valley, the bus turns off the Pan American Highway and descends into the wide valley, briefly stopping in the town of Aplao for dinner. Continuing through the valley, the paved road soon gives way to a narrower gravel road after passing through Andamayo. At the beginning of a barren cliff stretch leading towards the pass at Corapuna, a roadside shrine reflects rays of glimmering light from the offerings of candles. The bus pulls to a stop at the shrine, and the bus driver and attendant get out and walk to the shrine with candles in hand. They stand and pause at the gated entryway of a flower-decked altar that stands in front of statues of the Virgin lit up by the candles of earlier pilgrims. Nestled beneath the arches and among the flowers and paintings of the Virgin is a stone, adorned with blankets and ceremonial regalia. They light their candles and offer prayers before resuming the torturous climb into the mountains. Leaving the shrine, 6 long hours remain in our journey to Ndagwa, an ascent of over 2,500 meters. The road to Ndagwa is treacherous, and there are numerous occurrences that indicate the real risks to these highland roads. Landslides resulting from rains and earthquakes are always a looming threat. The earth convulses and liquefies when seasonal rains saturate the hillside, or tectonic forces melt the earth and set it in motion. The narrow dirt roads are cut precariously into the sides of cliffs and mountains with barely enough space for 2 cars to pass. The line of life and death is omnipresent. With this session inviting the exploration of the elusive object of conversion and approaching it through a lens of movement, in this presentation, I examine the formation of regionality, attending to how matter comes to matter. Regionality involves an ongoing and historical dialectic between a here and a there, marking a map of history. This work partakes in theory as purposeful wandering, to quote religious studies professor Thomas Tweed as he wrote in his book Crossing and Dwelling Towards a Theory of Religion. This work further recognizes the limit of theory's tendency to reduce the world to the dead matter of cause and effect. What stirs someone, that is how past, presents, and futures are affectively imagined and acted upon, quote unquote, depends on where you stand in the landscape of the present, as anthropologist Katie Stewart notes in her discussion of nostalgia. Acutely aware of worlds that exceed our grasp to impose meaning, Stewart offers another useful perspective in her discussion of regionality. To quote her, on the one hand, regionality is the sheer recognition of a sheer recognition. We're from here. But this very recognition is constituted in moves and encounters that continually reset the self-world relationship. The regional habit here to venture out mapless compulsively produces a vulnerability that marks those from around here as active survivors of the unexpected encounter and knowing readers of emergent situations. In this presentation, we continue along this journey to Ndagwa, recognizing that history is not a straight line, and to get from here to there is not filled with homogeneous empty time, to invoke Walter Benjamin's critique of linear abstract historiography, but filled with the presence of now. In Ndagwa, Spanish colonial officials confronted a landscape of difference, where confusion would soon give way to intractable ambivalence unfolding during an enduring conquest. The bus continues lumbering up a zigzagging road that climbs to the high pass on the shoulder of Korapuna, a massive volcano surrounded by highland plains and wetlands that stands as an impressive barrier between Ndagwa and the Pacific coast. The Highland Valley towns of Mashguai, Viraco, and Chuquibamba are visible below to the west at the upper folds of the Majes Valley. Reaching the pass, the thin atmosphere is acutely palpable. There, 3 to 4 hours remain in the ride, and the bus cabin is drifted to sleep despite the uneven and rocky dirt road. People bundle in blankets and jackets and moisture condenses on the windows as the cabin warms, contrasting to the cold mountain air. At the height of the snow-covered mountain pass, a sea of stones lies scattered along the roadside in the direction towards the peaks of Korapuna. A large rock cairn near the road has a cross staked into it with glass bottles hanging like scales of justice. Additional glass bottles are strewn across the rocks as offerings. This is an apacheta, an Andean road marker that signals the transit across perilous routes and places. Traces of stone paths are visible along the road, indicating the past networks of relationships across the Andes. It is difficult to ascertain the antiquity of the apacheta, which grew over time as travelers added rocks to it as informal offerings to Korapuna. Cars and buses were only able to reach the Ndagwa Valley after the 1950s, when local Ndagwa community members built the stretch of road arriving to Ndagwa after crossing the pass of Korapuna. Spanish colonial accounts describe the path to Ndagwa as a tedious, long, and difficult journey along dangerous rocky paths, over high capricious mountain passes nestled between the looming peaks of Korapuna. For centuries, locals and foreigners have revered and feared the landscape and the surrounding Andean chain of volcanoes, with the peaks of Corapuna and Salamana, among others, described as regional deities by Spanish colonial chroniclers and officials in the 16th and 17th centuries. Just as the Inca set offerings and sacrifices at the heights of the impressive and distinct peaks the Spanish listed these places as imbued with dangerous intentions and bearers of subversive practices. Through the 19th and 20th centuries, the region has been chronicled and studied by explorers and scientists for its distinct geological makeup of volcanic moundscapes and anthropogenic landscapes. The glacial peaks of Corapuna are not visible from the Indagua Valley, also known as the Valley of Volcanoes. It is hidden by the rising mountain slopes, yet it looms large over residents with glacial runoff irrigating fields in the valley. In Indagua, also known as the Valley of Volcanoes, I learned of an anthropocentric oral history involving a battle between local volcanoes that served Corapuna against a superhuman interloping Inca claiming universal authority. The story further tells of how the daughter of Corapuna, named Huachalanca, a mountain peak across the valley, became pregnant with the Inca's offspring by standing over a place where the Inca urinated while he took a break from building canals throughout the valley. The story ends with the sky raining fire, Huachalanca becoming stone and Corapuna covered in snow. It was over the pass of Corapuna that indigenous residents would take the walk of grievance, or Quejapurachi in Quechua, to voice their claims against the communal in the 19th and 20th centuries, where colonial and national archives and the seats of power were located. While community members of Indagua recounted a range of oral histories and local knowledges, people identify the sharpest era of subjugation in the recent past during the contemporary Peruvian nation state, which took on the form of what is known as communalismo. The communal was a local landlord who operated at the margins of the state and the intersections of the colonial products of race and class to exploit local populations to perpetuate a servile labor order. I've heard passing accusations of assassinations carried out in the Highland Pass near Corapuna before people could arrive to the Majes and regional authorities to air their grievances. Traveling from here to there with the walk to grievance was a dangerous and risky undertaking. There is a lingering sense of pain that in some cases justice will never be delivered. In the dark late night, after crossing the mountain pass, the bus eventually arrives to the small town of Indagua. At 3 a.m., the bus is 11 hours into its journey, and Indagua is one of its last stops. Bodies worn and tired descend from the bus, huddle in the cold air, and slowly disappear from the central plaza down quiet streets and around sharp corners. There's an empty fountain at the center of the plaza of the contemporary town of Indagua. Atop it stands a muleteer, or arriero, iconic of the region, known for its regional trades and caravans, as well as llameros, or llama herders. The fountain stand and surrounding pool are made with the base of cement and volcanic rocks of red and black carved from the surrounding lava flows that make up the valley floor. Stone discs painted red, geometric and anthropomorphic designs adorn the top of the fountain pool edges. The municipality, fully aware of the surrounding local heritage, has collected and displayed these remains. Stone discs are found throughout the valley, often exposed in agricultural terraces and due to contemporary road and building construction. Local community members speculate that they were the money of the ancestors. Our archaeological study, the Proyecto Arqueológico del Valle de Indagua, which involved the first systematic archaeological investigation in the valley, documented thousands of painted stone and ceramic discs and tablets, including placed with contemporary crosses. Ubiquitous throughout the Arequipa region, painted stone discs and tablets have been documented by several other archaeological projects, with the practice generally considered limited to pre-Hispanic times, stretching from early human presences to the late pre-Hispanic. While a detailed discussion is beyond the purview of this paper, we can return to the 18th century court case. In the court case, witnesses describe how the gentiles or Gentiles called the painted stones muyu, which not only means circle in Quechua, but is a multivalent term that is suffused with ritual significances across the Andes. While Gentiles or gentiles is the term colonial Andeans would refer to the pre-Hispanic remains, highlighting the effects of Spanish evangelization. The painted stone discs were described as part of a ritual, invoking the Lord's Prayer, responsible for the celestial forces in the sky, with life and death consequences. A witness recounted the ritual performed by curandero claiming, the favor of luck in the star signs of the sky that make the stars fall towards the birth of the sun, ensuring life and governing the Pueblo of Indagua. But he noted that if the sun fails to rise, you will die. To lower the stars, the curandero would take out coca herb from a sack and some painted stones, piedras pintadas, of the Hinteladad that are called muyo, supplicating, waving them while reciting the Lord's Prayer, Padre Nuestro. Ritual practices in the Indagua Valley exemplify how life and death matter hybrid places and assemblages that are not reducible to abstract identities. More than 25 years ago, a young boy went running after loose sheep in the valley folds below Corapuna, an area named Anohara, one of the local Waka who served Corapuna and battled the Inca. He came across a cave in the hillside where he found several human remains and alerted the local community of campesinos, community of farmers. Today, the community of farmers collectively stores the remains. The enduring human remains, as well as their absence from social memories, are further evidence of both the limited reach and efficacy of Spanish colonialism. The community primarily refers to the remains as las momias and occasionally calls them los abuelos. While claiming limited to no genealogical relationship to previous inhabitants, residents are still affected by their relationships and absent presences, inspiring both fear and awe. Residents here, preparing for both the expected and unexpected encounters with the past, walk around the valley, often carrying quinoa and garlic as offerings to feed and appease those who came before, with the material landscape and conditions for life and death a testament to their own lives. A here and a there is always ongoing, making present maps of history. Thank you. All right, I'll stop sharing. Excellent.
Thank you, Alex. All right, so those are all of our talks. If there are any questions or comments, I suppose we can take a couple minutes to attend to those. If anyone wants to use the raise hand function or ask something in the chat, we can do that. It's been a long session. All right, well, thank you so much again to all the presenters. It was so nice to be able to bring together work from so many different places and time periods, and to have this conversation and to kind of be able to engage with what is kind of like maybe some of the quirkier stuff that we think about as archaeologists in this topic of thinking about religion and conversion. And movement. And thank you so much to the chat folks for organizing. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Johanna, Emma, Shelona, Olanrewaju, Scotty, Alexander, and well, attendants, no, Dan, Caroline, Kai, and the ones that are not with us now, no, because we have been having some people coming in and dropping out, but it has been really interesting, no? And I have to say that I'm not really a specialist about missions, pilgrimages, on processions and all that, and I have been enjoying it a lot, no? Because one of the nice things that we are learning this month, no, with the conference is all the really interesting projects that you all have around the world, and coming to share them here with us, it's something that we have to thank you about. And well, just wanted to say that the whole session is recorded, so once I have it in private in the channel, I will send you the link so you can check it in case there is anything you don't like or something. And if you agree to make it public, we can make it public in the channel. So also the people who could not attend today can have a look at it and maybe comment on it. And even if you want to publish the session, okay, we also have a line in bar and other options available from chat, and we would be probably very happy to put something together with all you, and if you want to include someone else that couldn't be here too. So, well, from our side, just a huge thank you.
Thank you.